beyond words, really, to welcome all of you here to this lecture. This is a moment when you feel sort of in the universe, lots of things coming together at the right time in the right place with the right people. And let me take a moment just to introduce the various strands of this tapestry that are coming together, because it's quite remarkable. I won't say much about the national discussion, other than to say that certainly issues of policing, implicit bias, reform, data are somehow lurking in the, if we can get through some of the fog, but some of those issues come through the national discussion. And let's be hopeful that in the coming administration there's an opportunity to focus on some of these questions and issues more intensively. But more closer to home here at John Jay, we have a number of strands that have come together to weave this tapestry. This lecture is the inaugural lecture of the Franklin A. Thomas Professorship. And I'll introduce Phil Goff in a second, but the first individual that we want to pay a special tribute to is Frank Thomas. So there's a bio that you can read, but let me just give you my take on Frank Thomas. He grew up in Brooklyn. That makes him special to those of us who are Brooklynites. And went on after large family, single mother, determined parent who believed in education, went on to do well in school and received a scholarship, an academic scholarship, not an athletic scholarship, to Columbia University, where he attended and excelled. Then followed another path into the military service for a number of years, served our country in that way, then came home and went back to Columbia to go to law school. So there, opportunities open up for a talented young lawyer with that sort of pedigree. But Frank decided that he wanted to continue to work in public service, and served as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then he came to the attention of one of the great leaders of our country and of our state, Senator Robert Kennedy, who at that time was thinking, how do I do something meaningful on issues of poverty in New York State, and had an idea that he was developing with others to create what became the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. And somebody told him that to think about who should be the leader of this initiative, that he should look at this individual named Frank Thomas. Now, in the meantime, Frank had not just stayed at the U.S. Attorney's Office, he had gone to work at the New York City Police Department. Now, something that Frank and I have in common is we both held the same title, Deputy Commissioner for Legal Matters at the NYPD. Frank was appointed to that job at a very difficult time in the mid-'60s in our city when, if you know your history, there were race riots, a lot of them involving police and issues of race and crime and civil unrest. So for the police department to appoint to its chief counsel position a talented African-American with a stellar pedigree was a big moment for our city, and Frank Thomas filled that bill. But then he had this other opportunity to go to Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation as its first president. So the story is legend of what he did there by creating, in some ways, the model for the country as a community development corporation, raised lots of money, brought in lots of resources, helped people in Bed-Stuy find work and the like. And he created a even larger sort of national profile for himself and local profile. There are those who still say to this day that if Frank wanted to run for mayor, he would have been easily elected. He chose not to do that. Maybe he's a wiser man than others. But then the opportunity, a next opportunity came for him to head up the Ford Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic entities in our country. Then and now with a global reach on human rights and issues of economic development and good governance. And Frank Thomas led that institution for many years with great distinction. and then stepped down and became actively involved in a number of international issues, most notably in South Africa. And when Frank and I first met, our first meeting to talk about what's happening here today, he was talking about some conversation he was having, and then I turned to Nelson and said this, and I said, wait. You're telling me a story about you and Nelson Mandela? And he said, yeah, when I was talking to Nelson. I said, okay, got it. So when we were thinking about creating this professorship, a named professorship at John Jay, and wanted to name it after somebody who embodies so much of what John Jay is about, our connection with policing, our connection with the law, our connection with issues of racial justice, our connection with a sort of global reach, the person who came to mind was Frank Thomas. So he's here today. He's asked to sit in the last row, so you won't see him when he stands up, but I'm going to ask him to stand up just to be recognized. Frank Thomas. So not all good ideas become reality. We learn that in life, and we're reminded of that every day. So this idea of an endowed professorship became a reality thanks to two foundations and individuals in those foundations. And if you know this name, you'll understand why he was also a critical part of this. Herb Sturz, one of my life mentors, was the first person I approached to float the idea of naming this professorship after Frank. He said, absolutely. He works at Open Society, and he became sort of the guide behind the scenes here. But the first person that I approached was the current president of Ford, Darren Walker. Darren is well known to the John Jay community. He has been a very active supporter of a number of our initiatives here. He couldn't be here today, which is not a surprise given his schedule and his sort of global reach. But this idea is a reality only because of Darren Walker. So I know that he sends his greetings, and he sent two of his colleagues here, both of them well known to John Jay. I want to ask them to be recognized both for who they are and for representing Darren. And that is Tanya Koch, who's here somewhere, and Doug Wood, who's right next. There we go. So the second stop on the making this idea a reality process was to speak to colleagues at Atlantic Philanthropies, which has supported Phil's work over the years. And if you know this story, Atlantic is winding down, and they're trying to make investments that sustain the gains that they have made through those investments in the past. With help from Tanya, who used to work there, and another colleague who I'll introduce in a second, the second foundation that we thank today for their work and their support for this is Atlantic Philanthropies. And Chris Exley, the CEO of that philanthropy, and is Kavitha here? Kavitha Medarata not here? Okay, we're going to applaud her loud enough that she can hear, because I know she's on her way. Then the next individual and foundation that we want to thank is the Arthur and Patricia Hill Foundation. Arthur Hill is also an alum of John Jay, joined the police department as a young man in the 1960s, if I get my notes here, and rose very quickly through the ranks, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, but became one of the highest ranking African-American officers, leaders in the police department, promoted to the rank of assistant chief in September of 1971. We are very proud of his connection to John Jay here. He then went on to a second career as an executive for United Parcel Service. And when we had an event here, an alumni event, and we send out invitations to these events, who came but his daughter? So we've had discussions over the months and now years with Joanne Hill about what would be of importance to her father's memory, and it is to support the work of Phil Goff on bias in policing. So we're delighted that we also want to thank Joanne and her family, and through them, the memory of her dad here. So if Joanne, I can't see everybody, is here. There she is. Hi, Joanne. Just rise for a thank you. So I'll say a word about Macy's in a second, because you'll see that they get pretty prominent billing in this. But I want to also acknowledge, before I do that there are other colleagues and government officials who are here with us today. I think the highest ranking person in the room is another alum and one of my closest friends, First Deputy Commissioner of the Police Department, Ben Tucker, to be recognized. And the Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, another friend of long standing, Liz Glazer, who is here. And I gather that Mina Malik from CCRB is here, although I didn't see her. She gets applause wherever she is. And I'll ask you to recognize both of them, Lauren Harris from the Nathan Cummings Foundation and Nick Turner from the Vera Institute of Justice have also generously spent some time with us today. So thank you both, all of you, for coming. So another very interesting and productive partnership we have that leads us to today, another thread in the tapestry, is this relationship we have with Macy's. So Macy's, we know the Thanksgiving Day Parade, we know, great clothes, and I won't do the ad for them, but we know Macy's as a commercial institution, as part of the life of New York. We also know that Macy's went through a difficult time a few years ago on issues of shopping while black. So here's an example, in my estimation, of a company that has taken a difficult time and just turned it around and said, we're going to do something really positive with what we've learned about ourselves and about our industry. And Macy's then came to us at John Jay and said that they wanted to partner with an academic institution. We were honored that they chose us to host a series of lectures and workshops and seminars on the issues of bias generally, particularly in the enforcement of law, not limited to the retail industry, although that's obviously their interest. We had a very successful symposium on this topic last spring, and they have now provided financial support for a series of lectures on this topic. This is the first one. So that's why you see the co-sponsorship with Macy's, which is just a wonderful relationship that we've developed. So we have a number of individuals here from Macy's who represent the very high reaches of the organization. And I'll read their names and ask them to stand as a group. Elisa Garcia, who's the General Counsel, Chief Legal Officer, is here. We have Paula Barnes, also from the legal department. And Sharon Toomer, who represents them in public relations. And the spark plug behind all of this, who's been our point of contact for all these months, James Neal. If you'd all just stand so we can say thank you to you. Right. And please stay tuned for future announcements about continuation of this lecture series. So I'm going to come back in a moment and introduce Phil, which is a great pleasure. But we want to first share the stage with James Neal, who is talking about their partnership and why they have partnered with John Jay, the lecture series that they're hosting here. So join me in welcoming to the stage James Neal, Vice President of Macy's.
Thank you, President Travis. Macy's, and we have a one-day sale this week, don't we, guys? Right? Starts on Friday. Good evening, everyone. My name is James Neal. I'm the Vice President in the Law Department at Macy's Incorporated, as President Travis just mentioned. On behalf of Terry Lungen, our Chief CEO, Elisa Garcia, our Chief Legal Officer, William Hawthorne, our Senior Vice President of Community Affairs, and over 160,000 associates in New York and throughout the country, we welcome you to the Macy's inaugural lecture. Macy's is and has always been committed to the principles of exemplary corporate citizenship. As one of New York's most iconic, visible corporate citizens, we are moved to take solution or leadership positions on issues facing our society and therefore our company. Regardless of your political lean, no pun intended, there is no disagreement over the fact that race relations and policing indeed are two of the most pressing issues today, not only in New York City, but across our country. And even as we heard yesterday, there was another police-involved shooting in our community here locally. We must continue to engage in solution-oriented discussions about tragedies such as this. To this end, Macy's has established a partnership with John Jay College of Criminal Justice to create a dialogue with you, deeply concerned students, citizens, and colleagues. Today, we are very proud to sponsor the inaugural lecture series and delighted to feature a nationally recognized expert and lecturer on these topics, Professor Phillip Goff, whom President Travis will return to the microphone in just one moment. But again, I would just like to thank you on behalf of Macy's and all of our employees across the country. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you enjoy the lecture.
So I just want to point out, since we're talking about clothing, that James and many others are wearing purple today in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Day. So Macy's has a lot of purple things, and James decided today was the day to wear them, which is appropriate given the importance of that topic. So I'll make this introduction of Phil shorter than he deserves, because we do want to hear from him. But I think Phil Goff is one of the most important scholars and activists and public intellectuals in our country today, particularly on the issues of race, racial justice, bias, and the police and the criminal justice system. So you can see why it feels like this is where he belongs. So we're delighted that he has chosen to come here. So Phil's work has a strong scientific basis. So this is a true scientist. This is somebody with all of the rigor that you would hope for from a social psychologist, who tries to understand things both in the lab and in the real world. His work has been supported by all of the leading science foundations of the country and the private foundations as well. He testifies often before Congress. You'll see him often, maybe even tomorrow morning, on television. He is one of those scholars who finds a way to help all of us understand a very complicated world. And I met Phil a number of years ago, and we started talking about his work, and we created a collaboration that has now been funded by the Justice Department called the National Initiative on Community Justice and I just got the name wrong, and safety, I think it is. No, National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. There we go. This is us in Yale Law School, David Kennedy's national network here. And what I've seen is the power of his research to move the dial. Now, people can get up and criticize, and that's has its place, but a scholar who can help you think about how to do things differently, that's the type of scholar that I think is needed at this moment. So the Center for Policing Equity that Phil has created and now has brought to John Jay has become in a very short time this hub of scholars and police officials and community activists and journalists around the country who are trying to bring good science to difficult questions. And the most difficult question is how to understand implicit bias as it plays out in issues of policing. You may have read last week about the report put out in Austin, Texas, invited by the police chief in Austin, Chief Acevedo, to look at racial disparities in police actions, particularly the use of force. So this is the type of work that Phil does and the National and the Center for Policing Equity does, and the infrastructure that he's creating of the National Justice Database that makes this possible to do comparisons across jurisdictions is, in my view, because this is the way I like to think about things, is just going to be the engine that in the next decade, the next quarter century, is going to drive new thinking about these very difficult issues. And it's not just the police. It applies to school safety officers, it applies to school discipline, it applies to prosecutors, it applies to mass incarceration. But it's a way of understanding the impact of this apparatus we've created called the criminal justice system. So I am personally delighted, and as president of John Jay, consider this sort of a cherry on the top of the cake to be able to welcome Phil Goff to John Jay to give this lecture. I will come up afterwards and moderate some questions if we have time, but please, a round of applause for Phillip Goff.
Good evening. One more time. Good evening. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm home here. Okay. It makes me uncomfortable when people make a fuss about me, and there's been a lot of fuss tonight. So I know there's folks out there being like, why are we here to see him? I want you to know that I hear you, and I agree. But we're here. I'm going to try and offer a word, so y'all be gentle with me if you can be. So I often say this to my classes. I often say this to my friends. Though we are not in a black church, I am always of the black church. And that does not mean that you will be required to say amen during the course of the evening's events, though I'm really hoping that some of you will feel so moved. But it does mean that I have no intention of being up here and talking to a silent audience all night long. So I'm hoping that y'all can help me out as we go through this. That gonna work for folks? Yes? All right. All right, so just like President Travis and James before, there are a number of folks I want to thank before I start to try and earn my keep up here. Thank you to President Jeremy Travis. Your faith in me and the Center for Policing Equity has been unparalleled. So thank you for all that you've been giving to us. Thank you to James Neal and the people at Macy's for funding this tremendous event and for your leadership in the field. I have to say on a personal note, I am angry at James tonight because I was given assurances I was going to be the best dressed brother on this stage. And so you and I are going to have some words. Thank you to Joanne Hill for your partnership with your father's alma mater and for all the work that you were doing. Thank you for being here and for your presence. I have to say thank you to my beautiful and brilliant partner, Larissa, for your patience with and support of this journey. Nobody I'd rather be journeying with than you. I want to say thank you to my parents because I'm about to talk about them. Don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm only going to say good things. But I mostly want to say thank you for the language that you gave me and the certainty that we were never so together as when others were against us. I also have to say thank you to my sisters in struggle, Tracy Cassie, Meredith Schmidt, and Jennifer Eberhardt, without whom I surely would not be up here standing before you. And also, thank you to Franklin A. Thomas. To carry your name with us as we at CPE do this work could not be a more humbling honor. Know that we endeavor to carry it with the reverence that our ancestors gave to the power of naming, the power to define and redefine. We undertake this work of redefining bolstered by the strength that your name gives us. So thank you. And thank you to the staff at the Center for Policing Equity. Y'all don't see this, but these are the people that I would want to go to war with, and I go to war with these people every day, okay? It is no small thing to feel the weight of leadership, especially when you got here by accident, okay? I never intended to helm a research organization. They don't send you to school for that. That's not what I got my PhD in, right? I never intended to hoodwink all the brilliant people who work for me into devoting their most productive years for this vision that we share. And I never aspired to be responsible for such an obligation as their passion. Every day I wake up hoping to merit the honor that was given to me. And I do none of this work alone. So while surely it is the case that some folks do not see the work that the rest of the staff do, please, folks from CPE who are watching either on the live stream or here tonight, know that I see it. Okay. And finally, thank you to Trayvon Martin. Thank you to Michael Brown Jr., to Sandra Bland and Rakia Boyd, to Eric Garner and Amadou Diallo. Thank you to Emmett Till and Gracie Blanton. Thank you to Laura and L.D. Nelson, to Tyree King and Tamir Rice, to Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Pearlie Golden, and the thousands more who died without the benefit of an archivist to let the world know your name. You did not know when you woke up on your last day that your deaths would inspire the blues and jazz and hip-hop and poetry and prose, that your lives cut short would be the legacy that helps read sanity into the daily struggles of a people. But the violence you endured is our nation's birthright. And we are stronger as a nation for the weakness you force us to see in ourselves and this place that we sometimes call home. And because I thank all of them, I must also thank Charles Chestnut and Ida B. Wells for documenting all that they could for as long as they could. And for the young folks who are in the room, if you don't know Chestnut and Ida B. Wells, better ask somebody. Because without the stories of our ancestors, we have no words to describe ourselves. So what did I come here to say other than thank you? This is a little bit scary. I'm not so much intimidated by the size of the audience as I am by the size of the message I am struggling to get out of my body. Because when I think about how to talk about a mission of justice, which is what I got asked to do, to offer a word on, I don't know any other way to do that than to get a little bit personal. And that means being a black man in public, being vulnerable. Y'all know that's more than a notion, right? So please help me out tonight. Help me be worthy of your time. Because what I'm hoping for is that I want to talk to you about sanity a little bit. And then about how finding the words that make sense of the world, finding a language of justice, can help us stay sane. And since I don't know how to talk to you about how hard it can be to learn that language of justice without showing you, I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little bit. I'm going to tell a story from a long, long time ago, way back when I had hair, about trying to teach myself that language and how that process ultimately translated into the work we do at the Center for Policing Equity. And lastly, since I'm talking about how hard it is to learn justice as a second language, you may think that where we're headed is to a world where we try and give to the next generation justice as a first language. Nah, son, don't work like that. It can't be our first language. But that's not as hopeless as it seems, and I want to end up there. So does that make sense, everyone? We're going to start with sanity. We're going to go to language. We're going to hit Throwback Thursday, CPE, second language only, and then we're going to dismount. Does that work for everybody? Okay. So how do we get to sanity? I thought about a lot of things in terms of what the topic for tonight should be, right? The topic in the science, the flavor du jour is implicit bias. People talk to me about identity traps. There's a number of people who want me to talk about Prince and Allen Iverson because it's on my website and because those are two of the genius artists of our time. But in thinking about how to put together a talk like this, I wanted to say something that was worthy of the moment we find ourselves in. So I've been watching the debates and the coverage of the election, and as a result, I decided I wanted to say something that was worthy of a much, much better moment. Because last night was crazy, right? It's not me, it was them. That's crazy. I need to check, I need to be sure, right? So how do I offer a word that speaks to the insane moment we're in without succumbing to that madness? And I want to be honest. In preparing for, it's not just tonight, in surviving the last 2 years, I've been worried about my own sanity. In fact, I'm hoping tonight you all can help me forge some weapons against insanity, that we can do that together with each other. Because sanity is a precious, precious gift, and I don't think that we value it the way that we should. And let me be clear what I mean by sanity. When I speak of losing sanity, I'm not being trite. I'm not using mental health as a punchline. I am talking about the experience we've all had where something so shocks your sense of how the world is or ought to be that you gotta look around. You have to look for someone who sees the same crazy you do, or search for something that could explain this loud crack in a pillar of reality. But when I talk about losing sanity, I'm not only talking about that need to check for assurance, the I'm not crazy, in whatever witness God has seen fit to put in your life that day. Because sanity is a bigger concept than that. Sanity is not just a feeling. In fact, it's not a psychological concept at all. It's a legal term of art. Sanity has nothing to do with psychology as a science, really. It's a legal term. A sane individual before the law is someone with the capacity to line up their own actions with their consequences and the moral weight of those consequences. Sanity is the moral evaluation a court makes about whether or not someone can be held accountable for their actions. Sanity is the ability to be held accountable. And so when I say that this campaign season and the past 3 summers of watching black men, women, and children die on viral videos have been insane, I do not only mean that they have left me searching for something that feels better than this, searching for some set of eyes I can meet in recognition of the absurdity we saw in Dallas, where police officers were gunned down and a nation too often steeped in violence blamed the peaceful protesters walking beside them for it. I'm not just talking about the need to connect with someone who can understand that when we humbly state that Black Lives Matter and it's misheard as a declaration of violence, that can feel crazy-making. I do not only mean that buzzing that comes to my head whenever I check my phone and I find another mother's child has been promised to a pine box and left with a hashtag for a tombstone. When I say that this nation teeters on the raggedy edge of insanity, I mean that we are too quickly approaching a moment when none of us can or are willing to be accountable for the consequences of our actions. When none of us want to be accountable one to another. When I question the sanity of our nation, I am not calling names or stigmatizing mental illness. I am trembling with fear at the thought that we have so lost our North Star that we literally cannot make sense of how we ended up here. We don't have the language to explain to each other, much less our children, why the words they hear are so wrong despite coming from people who rank so high. We lack the vocabulary to say what is true, what is right, to say with words of conviction that we truly are better than the moment we find ourselves in part because we find ourselves in this moment over and over and over again. And that's why tonight, while I struggle for my own sanity in front of you, I want to talk about language. Now that may sound insane in and of itself. What is this Negro up here talking about language for? Bear with me. That feeling that you're going nuts, the feeling that leads to our inability to be accountable, it begins with a sense that our experience doesn't match up with the world that we live in. And what does a language of justice have to do with that? Well, to tell you that, I got to talk about what a language of justice is, full stop. To me, a language of justice is the words that are necessary to reveal the lies that injustice requires to seem legitimate. A language of justice is the words that are necessary to reveal the lies that injustice requires to seem legitimate. Because you see, injustice requires that we take for granted all kinds of falsehoods and half-truths in order to make us feel like injustice is good and righteous and that it's been there all along. The language of justice reveals the lies upon which injustice rests. Let me give you an example. When someone sees another unarmed black man being shot and killed by an officer or by a resident and responds with, well, what about black-on-black crime? A language of justice provides more than a stunned look and a shaking head. A language of justice allows for you to form words that reveal the lies that make black-on-black crime seem reasonable for anybody to form in their mouth in the first place. For instance, it provides me with the words to say that all state violence is offensive, and that violence in black communities is also the product of the state violence of poverty. It helps me to make plain that black-on-black crime distraction assumes that black people choose crime, like we pick out our clothes in the morning. And further, a language of justice makes plain the false assumption that somehow black people haven't always been concerned about violence in our neighborhoods, that somehow black people ignore the violence that we live with, and so few others are ever forced to witness. And it explodes the lie that these same black-on-black crime advocates have ever marched or protested or sobbed uncontrollably at the foot of a casket for that self-same black-on-black crime. That's what a language of justice can do. See, injustice requires a lot of lies in order to seem reasonable, and a language of justice is made up of the words we cobble together to make those lies plain. And here's what speaking a language of justice, what speaking simply the truth, has to do with keeping your sanity. See, when you speak the truth, when you find the words to make plain the lies you didn't know were lurking behind the casual violence you see and hear, you're also requiring that you stand up for the things that you believe in. By speaking a language of justice, you're holding yourself accountable to the injustices you experience. Here's the trick. By protecting your sanity, you've made yourself accountable. But not only that, by using a language of justice, you have also helped to cure whatever space you speak it in of the poisonous injustices that were spoken before you. And you can hold that room and the communities and the nation accountable to those lies. Because that language of justice, your words, have protected the nation's sanity as well. It's allowed you to hold us all accountable. See, the language of injustice doesn't afflict just you personally. It pollutes every person and institution it touches. So speaking justice preserves not only your own mental well-being, but the well-being of the communities that sustain you. And it creates a climate in which you can hold others accountable for the toxins they spill. By protecting a community's sanity, you have made it accountable as well. Are y'all here with me? Now, all this may sound a bit grandiose. This may sound like things that important women and important men should do at the highest heights of public life. But really, we all have experience with this search for words to protect our minds. Let me give you an example. You're walking out here on 10th Avenue. A car backfires, and you're startled. But your friend doesn't even flinch. So what do you say? You heard that, right? Someone you don't know pours a drink on your head as they leave the restaurant. You're sitting with your family, and your family cheers. What do you say? What is wrong with y'all? In those moments, we seek out social information. Okay? We want to see if anyone else heard the car, if any other patrons found that person's exit bizarrely aggressive. And when we find confirmation of our experience, then we have an explanation. Our friend was just distracted. Our family was watching the game on the TVs behind us, right? It makes sense. Okay, I understand. But if there's no confirmation, if there's no explanation forthcoming, what then? See, this is when the human mind needs to develop language to protect itself. Let me give you another example. You may recall the last time someone said something foul to you, and you didn't say anything back. You remember how the words felt and how you weren't really sure you could trust yourself to control yourself. Right? You might have been stunned by that galling arrogance. They could talk to you like that. Someone came up to me and said, "Oh, I love how you didn't feel pressured to dress up." I said, "What, I got a tie, my sock game is on lock. What mother, I don't." So when that happened to you, you remember the week or the 2 weeks or the month that you spent after that talking to yourself? Right? Y'all, and don't act like you're the only one. You know you do it. Saying all the things you wish you said back, and you imagine the setup for that perfect, "Oh, I'm going to get them," right? All this mumbling to yourself, all this talking to yourself in the mirror and having both sides of the conversation, okay? Here's the deal. That's not insanity. It's petty, but it's not insanity. In fact, it is often literally the act of protecting your sanity. Because what you're doing is looking for the words that restore the world to the way it should be. That perfect response, see, what it's doing is it's rejecting the insult that lies about who you are, and it affirms the righteous order of the world. And this is what having the right words so often does. So here's the trick. Speaking the truth is a weapon against insanity. The language of justice is armor against lies the world would tell you about who you are. All right, so here comes the hard part. Let me see if I can't make this point a little clearer by driving down memory lane on Throwback Thursday. A long, long time ago, in the greatest city in the history of the world, Philadelphia, I'm mad at y'all for laughing. Some 500 years before anyone knew who the heck Beyonce was, I went to high school. So I was a good student. I had a reputation as a relatively smart kid. I was liked by students and teachers because in this school, the nerds were the ruling class, right? But then senior year, something changed. My folks are getting ready for the story. They're going to have to relive it too. Sorry, y'all. I fell hilariously ill at the start of the school year. See, I contracted mono and hepatitis A at the same time. Yeah, it turns out, for those of you thinking about it, that's not awesome. Because the steroids they'd give you for the mono would kill you because of the hepatitis, and the stuff they treat you for the hepatitis would exacerbate the mono. So they basically say, yeah, you just got that. Good luck. Fun times, senior year. If you're thinking about getting the combo, go ahead and skip it. But the reason that I tell you that is to tell you this. Mono made me tired, and the doctor said, just rest. So that meant I missed a lot of school. It's like 2 months, right? A full 8 weeks. So after a couple of months, though, my body started to heal itself. And I didn't feel so terrible. My skin returned to something like a human shade of light-skinned. So I started going back to school class by class. But I started with the after-school stuff and then to the late classes and so on and so forth. Now, I had an AP English teacher whose class was first or second period every single day. And he caught wind that I was in school, but I wasn't going to his class. And this apparently was unacceptable. So one day, he confronted me after school during rehearsal for the play and let me know that he would begin to fail me if I didn't start showing up to his class. Mr. Goff, you don't attend this school to go to play rehearsal. You attend this school to come to my class. And I had one of those moments. Did y'all hear that? See, this was a popular teacher. My friends liked him. But he was treating me like I had already done something wrong, like I was something less than a good student, right? And there was a teacher supervising, but he didn't seem to care. He was in control. And I couldn't place my finger on it, but something felt off. Why was this teacher taking time out of his day to target me for what felt kind of like bullying behavior? The drama teacher didn't say nothing. My friends kicked rocks. They made jokes of it, and it remained an unsolved mystery for several more weeks, till I finally felt well enough to come back to school full time. And I'd almost forgotten it until that first class period back in AP English. And I walked in at the same time as everybody else, and this man started slow clapping me. Phillip Goff and his triumphant return. So glad you could grace us with your presence. It felt just like that. And I sat, and he wasn't done. He waited on me. He said, "You don't have anything to say for yourself after such a long absence?" And it felt just like that. And I asked him if he knew I'd been sick. Had a doctor's note and everything, and he rolled his eyes. And I don't remember exactly how we got back on to the reading for the day, but I do remember that throbbing in my head, that vaguely out-of-body experience that accompanies your world suddenly organized by a different set of rules. And it continued all year long. Every hard question targeted me. When I tried to contribute, he'd find something funny about what I wore or the size of my afro. I know it's hard to imagine now. Really, it was a long time ago, people. Stay with me. Anyway, nearly every week my friends would at some point laugh at me in this class. And I would lose almost every single skirmish with this man who acted like I deserved to be verbally beaten and publicly humiliated. And by the time I mentioned something to the other faculty members, I was convinced it was something about me. You ever have that? Where someone's messing with you so bad, and after a while you're like, well, maybe it's about me. You got to look at yourself first. I was convinced it was some flaw in me that made this happen, some defect that had always lurked inside of me that he had finally seen, and that gave him the right to share this with my friends who had been my closest since I was 6 years old. Now see, this was the school where I had come to learn about myself as smart and hardworking and likable and valuable. And these experiences, really just a couple weeks of it, was all it took to make me think like maybe I was crazy the whole time. Maybe these folks aren't really my friends. Maybe I'm not really valuable. So I had 3 favorite teachers. I asked my 3 favorite teachers. They were Carlton Bradley from jazz band, John McCullum, God bless, who until recently had been the AP English teacher, and Jackie Gowan-Tolcott, who taught me to speak French in a Cuban accent. And if you ever get to travel in Europe speaking French with a Cuban accent, go ahead, because that is good times right there. And I don't remember which one of them I told first, but as soon as I told one, they said, oh, we're going to get the others together. And they gathered with the spirit of revolutionary conspirators. And in response to me saying, this man makes me feel so small, they said, thank God. And I was really confused again. I said, what? I said, you didn't let me finish. Thank God it's you this time. See, he's done this to every single year, every kid that he comes across. Several kids, they even opt out of AP English because they don't want to feel that way. But he won't be able to do that to you. You're too smart. He won't be able to fail you. And I was completely confused. I have to say, I was hurt. That seemed callous. They're celebrating this terrible thing happened to me. And then John McCullum, God rest his sweet soul, he finished blowing my mind. He said, see, he can't get away with doing this to a black kid with good grades. What? I was stunned. I knew all three of them were black. And obviously I knew I was black. My students know I've been black my whole life except for like a week I took off in college. It was an experimental phase. It didn't work. I don't like to talk about it. Okay. So I knew I was black. But what in the world did that have to do with anything going on in my English class? And I asked Professor McCullum that, or Teacher McCullum. He said, Phillip, he's a bigot. And there's that lightheaded feeling again. I was gobsmacked. How could that be true? Because what I had come to understand about racism was that racism was backwards, and it was for stupid people, and it was Southern. That's why my parents must have left. And most importantly, it was vanquished. I mean, I knew it existed, but I had somehow picked up that it was kind of relegated to live out its days in squalor somewhere between some straw-chewing teeth and an outtake of Deliverance. You know what I'm talking about? It wasn't supposed to have an elite liberal arts education. It wasn't supposed to be a revered English teacher at my suburban Philadelphia high school. And because what I knew of racism was this caricature of Southern drawling anachronism, I wasn't prepared to speak the language my teachers were giving me. And their language didn't give me answers to each of the skirmishes I fought with him. And I remember them. He said, Phillip, since race doesn't really exist, isn't racism just paying attention to race in the first place? Phillip, since whites don't benefit from helping blacks, aren't they really more virtuous when they resist apartheid? Phillip, Martin Luther King abhorred all violence. So the people rioting over the Rodney King verdict are really dishonoring his legacy. They're literally dishonoring the name King. And tears. You know that's bull. You know he's full of it. But when he has power over you, when you can't just dismiss him as a person, do you have the words? Do you know how to win that argument, or are you going to go home tonight and talk to yourself in front of your mirror? Are you going to practice for the next time you hear that voice in your life? See, I'd gone to the same school for the same friends for 12 years, but all the kids in that class slowly started to turn away from me because I was the one making the class uncomfortable. I was the one spoiling for a fight. I was the one who just couldn't leave it alone. So I felt crazy. I spent most of the year talking to myself in mirrors, dreading every first period. I wasn't just being bullied. I wasn't even just being bullied by a teacher. I was being bullied by the world around me that lied about what was going on while I struggled to find language that would make sense of any of it. Because here's the thing. When you're not fluent in the language of justice, you end up stuttering a lot trying to speak the truth. I knew what he was saying wasn't right, but I didn't know how to say why. I knew he was lying, but I couldn't speak the truth. Because when he said that race wasn't real, I didn't know that erasing history has always been the first move of oppressors who want to rehabilitate their moral standing. I didn't know that. When he said whites don't benefit from helping blacks under apartheid, I didn't know how absurdly common it is for people who benefit from exploitative structures to forget that they were complicit in maintaining them. I didn't know how utterly ordinary it is for those who benefit from racism to imagine that it simply arrived here from outer space without the need for any individual to give it birth or to keep it strong. And when he said that MLK's legacy, the man who most of this country, and black folks too, thought was pushing too hard, too fast, and was provoking violence while he peacefully resisted unembarrassed bigotry. When my teacher said that MLK's legacy was dishonored by an uprising in Los Angeles in response to a justice system that refused to hold law enforcement accountable for a savage beating of an unarmed black man, I didn't know then how people use our ancestors to lie to us. I just didn't know. How people talk about Martin like he lived a comfortable life and died peacefully of old age surrounded by an adoring nation. How people talk like he wasn't assassinated for insisting on equality. How people conveniently invoke his name out of context without ever having read a word past dream, and forget that he was the one who said that a riot is the language of the unheard. See, King understood about language too. I didn't know. I didn't speak justice. So I struggled and I hurt for a year while this man laughed at me and my friends revealed themselves to be as unable to speak justice as I was. Then, I spent the next 21 years talking to myself in mirrors. Through various hairstyles and hair losses and beard configurations, I have been staring at myself, building a better vocabulary for naming what felt unfair in the world. And for all that time spent honing my speech and literacy, I have learned how to respond when someone tries to tear at the fabric of my reality. Not with defensiveness or anger, but with words that insist that justice be centered. And injustice has made the problem. I've gotten much better at feeling sane. My staff doesn't really understand that, but it's true. And from that, I've earned the ability to hold myself and the world around me accountable in the face of racial injustice. See, there's a vocabulary and a grammar and a syntax to the truth. You need to know the difference between the word disparity, which only means that things are different between different groups, and discrimination, which means somebody meant them to be that way. You know the difference between a stereotype, which is just the idea that Latinos are illegal, Muslims are terrorists, black folks are criminals. You know the difference between a stereotype and prejudice, which is belief that those things are true. But you also need to know that attempts to erase history are always grammatically incorrect. And that questions of power, asking who benefits from the world being set up this way, are the native syntax of justice. And as I learned that, it turns out other people wanted to hear about it too. In addition to protecting my sanity, what learning to speak justice has allowed me to do is to translate across multiple audiences that often have a hard time understanding each other. And I hope in that translation we give them some words of sanity, and this is the CPE part. So when a journalist asks me how I can appease both of the Center for Policing Equity's constituencies, the black and brown communities and the police, I get to correct them rather than feeling crazy. Because I don't see communities that have too long been subjected to racial violence and police who have too long been tasked with inflicting violence as separate constituencies. I understand why others do. I understand that the scripts we learned in our native tongue say that black and brown communities are not the police. Black and brown communities get policed. Our first language teaches us that cops go where the crime is and that compliance guarantees one's safety at the hands of the law, or that cops have never been about the mission of public safety and that racial hierarchy has always been the principal vocation of law enforcement. But I've learned a different language. I know that black officers go home at night carrying the same scars of racial discrimination and even fear of police that they see in the communities that they are sworn to protect. And I know that brown communities worry about raising their children amidst gun violence and pray for public safety professionals who are worthy of safeguarding their families. I know that very few people in this world aspire to go to work tasked with enforcing racist laws, and that both the police and the public are safer when the police are free from bias. I know that injustice is criminogenic, and I know that justice breeds peace. So what we've been trying to do with the Center for Policing Equity is to translate those words into a language that also has action. When we work between police and communities who have long distrusted each other, we provide them with new words for what's going on. We talk to them about implicit bias and identity threats, identity traps, and the power of procedural justice. We give them tools for measuring racial bias and a language for explaining that racial disparities in policing are not the same thing as racial discrimination by police, but that both of those things are always moral imperatives. We use humanizing words for the stresses of doing a job where people with nothing left to lose can use you as a target for their misdirected rage or as a tool of their own suicidal cowardice. And we use legitimizing words for the broken trust that comes from communities whose parents, their parents, were locked up by police for being in a sundown town past curfew or for being too smart in a school they weren't supposed to be in the first place. And the goal is to help them trust us, trust the process, even when they cannot trust each other. See, the process gives them language that speaks to the full humanity of all the people involved. And because there is truth in it, It allows them to hold themselves and each other accountable. In other words, it allows for some sanity, or at least it creates some defense against insanity. And I think we've been pretty successful so far. Some federal government folks give us money. We get to write our words in peer-reviewed journals that up to 7 or 8 people read. I get invited to fancy government buildings to try and fix some of the biggest problems of the day. And best of all, my colleagues and I get to give this language away. Other people use it, other people speak it, and maybe for some, it becomes a weapon against insanity for them as well. So why on earth do I still find myself searching rooms for eyes that can reflect my reality back to me? Why do I have to check with you at the beginning of this very lecture to see whether or not I was crazy? Why do I increasingly turn off the television, shut down Twitter, and hunt for words that will make any kind of sense of anything going on? Isn't this just a new version of racism? Shouldn't I have figured this out in the last 21 years? Probably. But the reason I teeter on the raggedy edge again today is that I have a new set of responsibilities for which my language is not adequate. I have godchildren, Olakayo and Hoji Dimazi. Their names mean the joy that God brings and the lion of waters. That's a name. And they're growing up in this world, and my language is not sufficient to make sense of this world for them. My accent's too thick, my vocabulary is too limited. I'm not fluent enough in justice to make the nightly news safe for their hearts and eyes. And see, this is the last point about what we do next. Because I worry about the kind of life we're giving to my godchildren. Are we able to raise them to know justice in their mother tongue? Are they learning to read and write it? Do they speak it at school or just at home? Or are they learning a first language altogether different from justice? Are they learning a first language of apathy or fear or self-doubt? Or worse, are they learning a first language that is that toxic self-assurance of good intentions? See, the problem is that you have to learn justice as a second language. Because the language of justice can only be used to strip away the deceits that underwrite injustice, that language is only as good as the truth it reveals. And as injustice evolves, so too must the language of justice. The words handed down to me by my parents were not lies. They were simply not sufficient to engage the world I grew up in. A language of separate water fountains and cross burnings does not translate to a world of integrated high schools and Black Lives Matter. A language of affirmative action and respectability politics does not translate to a world of tech startups and the Oscars so white hashtag. Please somebody tell me that you're hearing me when I say this. The language you forged as a weapon against insanity will not fit in the mouths of your children. It will not work as a weapon against the world that wants to lie to them about themselves. It will not lay plain the history, the assumptions, the structures, and the power they will need in order to set themselves free and hold their world accountable. So here's this lesson. Don't only hand down your words to the next generation. Don't only hand down your powerful language on stone tablets. Teach them instead to love the finding out. Teach them to search for the eyes that return them to themselves. And when those eyes are shut, teach them how to learn to teach themselves to speak justice. Not by giving them your words, but by showing them how you learned and giving them the space to learn for themselves. Teach them that their words are powerful. Teach them that their words are more powerful than yours, and teach that to them because it's true. Teach them by listening to them and by encouraging their struggle for their own language, because your words will never be sufficient for the injustices to come. But theirs, if we teach them right, might be. This is why we need to understand justice always as a second language. Not because it's less important, because we're tardy in our studies, or because it has to be learned later in life, but because injustice has so many forms that there will always be need to be evolving dialects and idioms. And generations will always need to struggle past their first language, the tics and assumptions that come from it. The process of acquiring another language will always be difficult, always be painful, and always be full of mispronunciations. But if we learn to teach the process, they will learn to teach themselves. And in doing that, we ensure that our nation has the reserves of sanity necessary to hold itself accountable for the injustices that founded it and continue to sustain it. And more importantly, we provide salve for children who grow up questioning the reality they touch and taste every day. We provide tools for young people to know themselves as separate from the evils done to them. To know themselves as separate from the evils that are done to them. and we let them know that they need not remain speechless in the face of injustice. Hope you all feel a little less crazy tonight. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you. Oh, okay. I didn't know we were going to do it this way. Okay. So
We have chairs.
we have chairs. So did we hear the amen? My goodness, Phil. So we're going to make ourselves comfortable.
Okay.
We do have a bit of time. We have a reception that's happening afterwards, but we are gathered as a community. And you've just heard just a remarkable lecture slash sermon slash meditation slash poetry. I don't know what it was, but it was quite something. And I think all of us in different ways are absorbing what we've heard to make sense of it. But this is a time for people just to engage with Phil. If you have a question, we have folks up front here who have microphones, so your question can be heard by all of us. But just raise your hand, and there's somebody in the back. And if you just do us the favor of giving us your name right before you ask your question. No, just hold till you get the mic.
My name is James Fitzgerald, and over the course of my life, I've become more and more interested and passionate about prosecutorial misconduct. It burns me to the core. I am starting to put part of my resources in my life, my time towards that, and my financial resources. And I'm asking you, what organization in this country do you admire most that works to fight prosecutorial misconduct and to bring prosecutorial reform to this country?
Ooh.
Sorry.
Yeah, no apologies necessary. It's a big question. It's a hard question. We just had here, on Wednesdays, we have the Justice Nerd Lecture Series. And we just had John Pfaff yesterday, who was talking about not just prosecutorial misconduct, but the little legal things that prosecutors are empowered to do that have helped to produce mass incarceration. That a county elected prosecutor may be, in fact, incentivized to charge somebody with a felony, because if you get a conviction on a felony, that goes to the state, not to the county. That's state budget, not county budget. So we have these perverse incentives. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I would say if John had a center, then I would say give him some money. I'm not going to talk bad about him, but he could always use it because he's doing all kinds of great work. I would also say that right here at John Jay, the Misdemeanor Justice Project is looking at ways that justice structures can protect those from escalation of charges. But in terms of places that are focused laser-like on prosecutorial misconduct, I mean, President Travis, if you've got a word involved, I'd love to hear it.
So let me give a partial answer to the question. I think the bottom line answer is there is no institution that has that as its mission. At John Jay, we have recently created something called the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution. It is part of David Kennedy's national network. I don't know if Meg Reese is here. Is Meg here? Headed up by Meg Reese, and I would encourage you to get in touch with her. It's a new startup launched in August, I guess, with $3 million in forfeiture money from the Manhattan DA's office. And the whole idea is to bring together prosecutors and academics and others to imagine a new role for prosecutors in a justice vision that's quite different from what we have today. This is a heavy lift. This is a really tough mountain to climb. And I didn't hear John's lecture the other day, but one of his sort of talking points is how unaccountable in terms of public accountability prosecutors are for the exercise of a very powerful discretion. And my hope is that the institute that is being set up here that has a 3-year lifespan will at least start to open up some conversation. This is going to be a very tough nut to crack. I'll also point out that on Monday, I'll be in Washington for a one-day conference, invitation only, sponsored by the White House, on the role of prosecutors in criminal justice reform. And it was wonderful for them to come to us, to ask for us to co-sponsor this. So there's this, you can feel it, there's this recognition in the country, and your question is part of it, that we can't do what has to be done to bring about justice without taking a very close look at the way that prosecutorial power is exercised. The final point I make is that there's a sadness in our community that we just lost Ken Thompson, who was, I think you could nominate as being one of the leading lights in prosecutorial innovation and thinking differently about the role of the office. And at age 50, he was stricken with cancer. He's a John Jay alum. I was honored to speak at his memorial service on Saturday. But there are others like him. And what we're trying to do through the Institute is to find those thought leaders who are trying to grapple with your question stated differently. So who else has a question here?
Is Meg here?
I asked whether she was here, and I didn't see her raise a hand. But it's Meg Reese, R-E-I-S-S, at John Jay. Yeah.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for that masterpiece in Black rhetoric as a scholar
And
of
you are?
Dara Byrne,
Say hi about that.
interim dean of undergraduate studies, and a professor of African American rhetoric. So you hit all of the elements of Black rhetoric, and I really appreciate that because it gave a true testimony to the work that you're doing, but also the longstanding history and legacy of the contribution of Black communities to the moving justice forward in this country. But I wanted to ask both of you, because you're working at academic institutions, and the kind of work that you've done and that you continue to do don't necessarily have to intersect with schools. So maybe could you talk to us a little bit about why you choose schools, what you think about the role of education and academic institutions in this language of justice? Because you could be completely independent and autonomous, but yet you make these specific choices. What does that mean in terms of curriculum, in terms of students, in terms of the place of the academy in this agenda?
Thank you for that question and for those kind words, Dara. People ask me why I'm not formally in government, given all the work that we do at CPE in government. And then they ask, why I'm not out being a hype man for somebody at a hip-hop show. That's because I'm old. But the real reason that the Academy is home for this kind of work is because this kind of work is a struggle and an exploration, right? I hope that, I'm sure I didn't sound all that polished up there, because I'm struggling, I'm exploring as I'm trying to figure it out. And as we're stumbling forward through it, the Academy is set up to do that for you. As we go into classrooms, I explain to my students that we're gonna figure this stuff out together. And I'm ahead of you just because I have been doing this for longer, right? But just because I'm ahead of you doesn't mean that I caught all the good glimpses behind me. So teaching is the way that I know that I understand, because if I can't explain it, I didn't really understand it. So as I use my classroom for the scholarship that I'm doing, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm going to the hardest concepts and seeing, am I ready to teach it, right? And my students tell me whether or not I'm ready, because they tell me whether or not they understood. And more often than not, what they say is, you weren't ready to teach it, but we were ready to learn. So they'll explore with me. And I can't have that as my job as assistant secretary of some state. I can't have that as my job in an AG's office, because there's deadlines about policy and there's cycles to running for things. And that's the other part. I don't run for things, and Center for Policing Equity doesn't take money from any of our law enforcement partners, and that's, Forbes has written that up actually in terms of a business model, and it's called that terrible, because we don't make any money that way, but it helps with truth telling. And so part of being in the Academy is it is your vocation to tell the truth in ways that other people hopefully haven't previously. So that there couldn't be a better fit for that. And having been a student, having continued to be a student my whole life, the greatest privilege that I've had in being a student is to watch people in their passions and let them shine light in places where I might want to go.
You want me to? So it's wonderful to watch Phil come to John Jay, and as you can tell, we're friends, and we've been fellow travelers on lots of parts of our journeys, and to see him react to our student body is just heartening. Because what he's discovering is what we know, and Dara certainly knows in very important ways, is that the students who choose to come to John Jay are choosing to come to a place because of what it represents. And it is unique in the country. Our motto, Educating for Justice, is very elevating, but it's a challenge. And we had a wonderful town hall last week where, so we have a town hall, for those who don't know, where it's mostly students come in and sort of talk about what's on their mind, and it's an open mic sort of thing, very well sort of organized, and so we get maximum attention. And one student stood up and complained that the official Twitter account of John Jay had celebrated Columbus on Columbus Day. And he had a very well formulated critique of Columbus in terms of the sort of destruction of indigenous peoples that followed that thing that we were celebrating, his discovery of this hemisphere. And my response to that was that any day we talk about our mission, our justice mission at John Jay, is a good day. We should talk about it more. And I know, Dara, you're thinking about how to integrate it into curriculum, which it sounds like Phil can, and you can sort of talk about that some more. But any time it becomes central and not peripheral to the conversations that we have in the hallway or in the classroom or on field trips, that's a good day. And that is true to who we are and what we've become and what we aspire to be. And the more difficult it is, the better. Because this is a struggle. This is a learning process for all of us, myself included, Phil included, and we need to be challenged. And so this institution is, I love it dearly, in part because of that, in large part because of that sense of being in search of, educating for, and being fierce advocates for justice. So no other institution can lay claim to that. And that just makes this a very important place for our students, for all of us, and let's get grandiose for the country. There's another hand in the back over there.
Hi, I'm Professor Peter Moskos here at John Jay College, and I was wondering how you would apply or advocate the language of justice specifically to policing and police officers who may be less interested in what is literally semantics in their interactions with the public, but specifically also with criminals.
So thanks for that, Peter. I think we struggle with that when we do trainings with line officers, when we talk with executives, when we talk with supervisors. We struggle with sort of the right sort of level to be pitching it at, because people, when you give them a thing, you say, hey, here, use this, anything that feels like a pitch, they recognize their radar going up. And they want to know, how is this going to be useful to me? How is this going to serve me? What we've done, and this is in consultation with Tracy Mears, Tom Tyler at the Yale Justice Collaboratory, as we start to teach about procedural justice, we lead with, this is a tactical issue with the line officers. Right? If you don't understand that treating someone in a way that reduces their human dignity creates a neighborhood that is more dangerous for you as an officer, then you're missing a tool. And having the history, not just of the nation, but the history of this neighborhood, right? Old Willie's Barbershop that just got torn down and what that meant and how that went down. If you don't know that, right, then you putting out a cigarette butt, right, where Old Willie's used to be, you don't understand what kind of insult that is. That makes you less safe. It makes you less capable of doing your job. So we try and make it as concrete as possible when we're trying to translate this into the lives of individuals. But the point of an idea of a language of justice is that everybody speaks it with its own accent. I don't know that everybody in here knows that I'm from Philadelphia, though if I talked about the Eagles and water in the creek, then you might have figured it out. And I see some power signals out there. Yes, I understand. We may go 3-3 after this Sunday, but I believe in Wentz. Anyway, you might be able to tell, but you might not, because I spent some time in California, or you might not, because I spent some time in Massachusetts. My language, my accent's going to be different. So as you try and translate this, you try and get the grammar and the syntax down, which is that history makes you more powerful. It makes you less vulnerable. Getting the grammar and the syntax of don't start with, well, that's your perception. Perception is the wrong word. It's always experience. Because perception is about what you see, and that can be illusory. But experience is, that's as real as it gets. Those kinds of key concepts, when we say it in cop language, when we make it useful and we make it tactical, we get purchase there. And we get, well, you know what, this isn't as bad as all the rest of it. It's terrible because all trainings are terrible, right? And if you ever, any law enforcement in the room, you know every training is awful. But it's better than the other trainings. It's not just a Band-Aid on political correctness. And for me, that's always a win.
So we have time for one more question. Who has the microphone in this aisle? Okay, you both raise your hand at exactly the same time. Two short questions. No, right? Is there?
We got 3, actually.
Oh my goodness. Short question, short answer, because there's a reception for us all to talk to each other about to happen. So let's start with Stephen Handelman and the gentleman. You know what I'm going to do, just to really be a little. Everyone asks the question, put it in the air. Steve will respond. Your question.
Okay,
Phil will respond. Steve, your question is?
Steve Handelman of the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice at John J. Phil, it's great to have you here. I have a short question, but it's not going to be a long answer, so you won't be able to answer it today. But nothing complicates, as I'm sure you'd agree, the language of justice more than the language of journalism. How do you make those two languages speak to each other and work through each other?
Okay, hold on to that one. And your question, sir, is? No, it's right, the third one in. Yep. And you are?
I'm Mike Thompson from Macy's. I want to know, you talk about truth-telling. How do you break the culture within the police departments so that the officers don't acquiesce against what you would say is bad behavior, and they tell the truth and they don't, meet that comeuppance of the snitches get stitches sort of an analogy?
Okay, we got journalism, truth-telling, and then I'm guessing that's Jama Adams.
Oh, right there.
Jama Adams, Chair Africana Studies here. I guess my question has to do with capitalism. So it's 2 quick variants. 1, public-private partnerships. I mean, why should Macy's or anybody get involved in this? What's the upside for them? And secondly, an accounting issue. Given that everyone is quantifying everything, how does it profit a police officer to speak the justice of language, which can't be measured, it's not arrests, it's not prosecutions, et cetera, et cetera?
Great questions. Was there someone else that you wanted to comment?
So there was another young woman right there. She got her hand right there. Can we? Because that was actually the first hand I saw.
Was that the first hand? Okay.
Yeah, I want to make sure that she gets a chance to ask a question. Yes, you right there. There we go.
Hey, I'm Tanya. I kind of had a 2-parter, so I'm just going to scrap the first one because it was brilliant and complex. I'm just going to get rid of that. But my follow-up question was, what does French sound like with a Cuban accent?
Best question of the night. Okay. Okay, see what you can do with all of those, and then we're going to go out and go downstairs.
So the last one, je sais pas, je ne peux pas reconnaître. So, and then we got accounting, we've got incentivizing truth-telling, and we've got journalism. And Steve, thank you so much for that one. So let me see if I can do them in reverse order, because that'll help my brain to get them. So to Jama's question on accounting, we can measure good outcomes. It's just harder. We can measure pro-social contact. We can measure community empowerment. We actually have ways to do that, but it can't be just the police department that's measuring it, which means that the scope of community reform has to be larger than the lens on policing. And the reason for places like Macy's or any place else to get involved in this, I think I'm going to get a chance to tell a story that my mom can probably clarify or nuance a little bit, but I think I'm going to be telling true things. So we're from suburban Philadelphia. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. And what that means is not only do we root for the greatest sports teams and for the greatest city in the history of the world, but also we go to the greatest mall in the history of the world, which is the King of Prussia Mall whenever we go shopping. Okay? Y'all see, it's a religion for people y'all don't know. So we go to the King of Prussia Mall from time to time, right? And at the King of Prussia Mall, there's a bunch of anchor stores, and we almost always ended up going to Macy's first and last. And it's not just because it's very close now to the Cheesecake Factory, though that's also true. It was because, and for me, it was because my mom took me, and I was little and I needed pants. But a lot of what was going on was we were there because they employed the black teenagers who were otherwise there to be shopping, right? They employed the folks from the community. And King of Prussia, as a place, is not particularly diverse, but Philadelphia is. And Macy's would do that. So when we talk about policing, we talk about Robert Peel's principles, right? And the seventh one is that the public are the police and the police are the public. Okay? But that's the truth for any public serving institution. And there is money for it if you are a public serving institution for profit, right? If you reflect the values of the community, there's brand loyalty to be gained. It can be gamed for sure, but people, you can only be false for so long before people sniff that out. So that's what I think part of the incentive structure is. You just got to measure it differently, measure it better. This is, the second last question, Mike from Mason was asking about how you incentivize truth-telling and move beyond that wall of silence. Here is the thing that is the undersold story in policing, at least on the political left. Most of the officers that I know go into policing because they wanted to do the right thing for a living. That is the closest thing you can get to wearing spandex and fighting crime for a living that you can get without, getting locked up or really looking bad on yourself. Like some of us look better in spandex than others. So what that means is there are ways to appeal to your core nature and your values and say there are better ways to go. The idea that it's just about the culture and that the culture can't be switched with incentives, that's a romantic ideal. But it's not really the truth. If you make it safe for people to speak, they will. And everybody in law enforcement in this room knows about a time where a block of folks on a shift got together and they ratted somebody out, which is to say, this is racist, this is sexist, this is biased, this is not right, this is corruption, and I don't want to have that be part of my life, right? That took courage, yes, and that it took courage is a structural problem. Fix the structural problem, make it possible for people to come forward where accountability is encouraged and not informally punished, and you will see much more of that as part of the culture. It happens in organizational business. We know how to do that. We can do that in policing too. And to Steve's very special question, because he likes to give me questions that are going to be entirely too long to answer, I go back to incentive structures, and I don't know how to set up the right ones for journalism. As you know, we talk to journalists a lot. Not a day goes by that we don't talk to at least one. And the way in which a journalist's life is set up, especially now that print is in such precipitous decline, and I want to be clear, let me take a moment. Print journalism is saving this election season, okay? It's not a blog, it's not a listicle, you'll never remember what number 14 was. It's print journalism that is saving this election season. But the incentive structures for people to get clicks, to win Pulitzers and Pulitzers and Pulitzers, and then still their column gets pulled and they got to move to Metro. The incentive structure is perverse. So meeting journalism where it is not meeting it in a place that is hospitable for the truth. If you want to solve that, you have to get the most talented people, which is never a good, Du Bois talked about the talented test, but other than him, ain't nobody talking about elitism as saving the masses. So I think that's ultimately a self-defeating strategy. Or you got to talk to editors and tech startups and people who know how to create profit streams that will incentivize good, deep, honest truth-telling. And when I solve that problem, I will let you know. You should feel free to sell it to the highest bidder, and then you and I can retire on an island. Mine will be bigger than yours, but on an island privately. But until then, I'll just say that's the stuff that needs to change, and smarter people than I are going to need to figure it out.
Please join me in thanking Phil Goff. So we have a reception in the Shiva Gallery, and if you leave, when you leave the theater, you take a right, and there'll be people guiding you down. It's on a different level, but it's easy to get to. I look forward to seeing all of you there. I would be remiss if I didn't close out the evening without making some thanks to people at the university who made this possible, for Phil to be here. Bringing him and his center here required an investment that John Jay frankly didn't have. In addition to our foundation friends, the university, the chancellor supported this investment, knowing that it would be important for us. And I have to thank our provost, Jane Bowers, who was the lead quarterback in the multi-year recruitment effort. More conversations with Phil than we imagined at the beginning of this. And finally, Angela Crossman and her colleagues in the psychology department who have given Phil such a warm welcome to join them as a member of their faculty. But the thanks are to you, and let's work on this new language. Thanks.